Welcome to History H114, Western Civilization 2. I'm Professor Sock, and I will be the instructor for your course. This is a 100% online course, and it also has been determined by the university that it should be done in 13 weeks. To be quite honest, I'm not sure what the rationale behind that is for an online course. The lectures will be posted as soon as they're available, as soon as I can get them available and posted for you. And you are welcome and encouraged to work at your own pace. You do not have to wait until February 13th or 8th or whenever it is that the course officially begins to actually start. You can start when you would like. Um, and I would encourage you to do that because with a 13-week schedule that is simply squishing, so to speak, 16 weeks into 13 weeks. This is not a lesser course than the 16-week course. That's the regulations of the university, or the stipulations or guidelines of the university. That the 13-week schedule is somehow to keep us safer with COVID, but yet with an 100% online delivery, I don't understand the rationale behind that, but that is really not all that pertinent for what we will be doing here. I just want you to know that this was not necessarily not necessarily, not at all my decision to have it in this format. But that is what we're dealing with, and I hope we can make the best of it. I think this is a very valuable class, a very good class, and you'll get a lot out of it. Obviously, depending on how much effort and work you put into it, but we'll be talking about that as we go along. Now, this is the second part of Western civilization, which does not mean that you need to have had History H113, Western Civilization 1, as a prerequisite. This is a standalone course. It certainly would help if you have had H113, the first semester of this year-long survey of Western civilization, but it's certainly not required in any way, shape, or form. Um, but if you have had it before, especially if you've had it with me in some form, some of the early lectures and parts of the course will be somewhat familiar to you, or they should be in any case. But that does not necessarily mean that you would have an advantage over those of you who are coming to this course and have never heard of Mesopotamia or of Clovis or anything else. That's fine. There will be some background, which I'll be getting to in my next lecture, actually. Also for the first week, in terms of setting up the point of departure for this course, because this part of Western civilization is designed to discuss the emergence of modernity, first with early modern Europe and then modern Europe, continuing more or less until the present. How far we'll get, we'll have to wait and see, but that is the intent in any case. So, unless we can have some understanding of what came before, we won't really grasp the changes and the significant, in some ways, radical changes that took place in the course of the 16th century and on into the 17th century as what historians have called modernity developed. So that is in the broad scope of some of the preliminaries. But this entire lecture is a preliminary lecture because it is asking ourselves, what is this course all about? You know already that I am the instructor, and that is significant. And why it's significant is because if you haven't experienced this yet, you you will throughout the course of your university career. These courses that we offer are not independent from the instructor who teaches them. You could take this course, History H114, with another instructor, and in many ways it would be a very different course than my course. This is my H114, not someone else's. And that is something that is just the way universities work. And in my view, it is my responsibility as a professor at the university to bring to you, our students, what I can uniquely give you. You're actually paying for me as much as you are paying for the credits of this course, so to speak, if we want to put it in such brash economic terms. So the course is my course, um, that I hope you will make your course, and that we will, as we go along, will develop a greater understanding for the so-called Western tradition, and the impact that has had on us today, whether we are aware of it or not. And that phenomenon is something I'll be discussing more shortly in terms of the impact of history and the importance of history for us today. To begin with the preliminaries again to the course, or setting it up, we need to ask what we actually are doing here. Now, I have also posted PowerPoint slides, and if I look away a bit from the screen, it's because I am looking over at the PowerPoint. Um, I am not very technologically adept, and so I don't know how to have them both at once present for myself at one screen. So I'm not looking away from you, um, as if this virtual space that we're in, I can't even see you. You can see me, I can't see you. In a classroom setting, which I much prefer, there's the give and take, the back and forth, the stopping and asking questions, which we don't have in this format simply with a video. And I am struggling always to um, overcome the feeling that I'm not talking to you, but I'm talking at you with a video. I will try as much as possible to talk to you rather than at you in this format as I possibly can. Um, but one of the advantages, even though you can't raise your hand and ask a question, you can stop the video, go back, review. If you do have questions, as I hope you do, please send me emails. We can do it virtually as well. It's just not in real time as a question comes into your mind. So please feel free to note down questions that you might have as we go along, and you can send them to me and I'll address them in that fashion. Um, what it is we are doing here, besides fulfilling a requirement and hopefully getting a grade. And I'll be talking more about that practical aspect later on in this lecture. But to begin, we have to realize that Western civilization is not a thing itself. It's a problem. And often universities have gone away from Western civilization. They have world civilization courses. We too have a world civilization survey, History 108 and 109, that you could take as well, in addition to or in place of Western civilization. The idea of moving away from Western civilization is that Western civilization is very Euro-American centric. It is focused on us, and also, in addition, traditionally has been seen as the story of privileged white males. And indeed, Western civilization courses developed in the late 19th century on into the 20th century by European American scholars, predominantly privileged white males, to tell the history of us, of them, of me. Because here I am, a privileged white male, lecturing on Western civilization. Now, there may be a phrase that you've heard. It's probably somewhat old-fashioned or an indication of my own age and, and background. But we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bath, so to speak, if that means anything to you. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. But what it means for me in this context is, yes, there are problems with Western civilization. There are problems with the very concept. And that problematization of those concepts that are present in the title of the course itself and what it is, the content thereof, so to speak, need to be problematized and analyzed. If we just say, oh, that is skewed, ideological, we should just move on from there, we're just replacing one ideology with another. Now, ideology is one of those terms that you may be thinking of, yeah, that's a negative term, that's a bad term, it's Marxist ideology. And we'll be talking about that as we go along. But that is not what I mean by ideology. The term ideology was developed actually in the 18th century by a French scholar who used it as a way to refer to the history of ideas. Now, subsequently, a whole field of history arose called the history of ideas. There is still an academic journal called the Journal of the History of Ideas. But that too has been problematized and analyzed, and scholars have moved away from this focus on these abstract ideas that we can see developing in a realm in many ways completely divorced from history, so that these ideas are floating in some sort of ether, and we can look at that ether on that upper level, basically divorced from the historical actual context in which those ideas developed and arose and the impact that they had. For example, and we'll be talking a lot about this throughout the course, and it's actually the focus of your project, which I'll be talking about later in this lecture. The concept of human rights. What are human rights? Where does that idea come from? That is an idea. We can't identify and put on a table even one human right. That's something that humans have come up with, discovered, developed, and in a very somewhat recent fashion. It was only the later 17th century that we begin to see discussions of humans have rights simply for being human. Previous to that, that was not a concept. There were rights and privileges according to your status in society, your role in society, but not just because you're human. Now we can say, oh, that is simply a concept of progress, that we have then discovered something that previously was unknown, either from ignorance or from willful repression, but now it has come to light. We have discovered human rights just as we have discovered a new planet, or in the 16th century, a new world geographically, which we'll come back to that as well. Also an ideological construct. But this idea of progress, what do you make of it? Are we getting better and better? Is modernity better than medieval society? It's different, but is it better? If it is better, if you think that it's better, why is it better? Those are questions I want you to think about as we go along, because it's so easy to look at the past and see, oh, this has all led to me. Isn't this wonderful? We have progressed to the point where now, not only do we have Tupperware, we also can go to the moon, and we have internet. What a wonderful development of technology and human ingenuity, and we are getting better and better and better. How is that defined? What do we mean by better, by progress? Are people today happier than people 500, 1,000 years ago? Are people more satisfied? It's funny, in the history, almost all the way back, we find two oppositional overall views. One is that of progress, that we are getting better and better. We are learning more things. We have more pieces of information, and that is almost unquestionable in terms of the quantifiable knowledge that we possess. Progress, though, development, certainly, but why do we call it progress? But at the same time, as this view that we're getting better and better and better, there's also been this view of, God, the world is going to hell. Again, this may be aspect of my age, but maybe some of you have heard something like this. Parents or grandparents saying, well, you guys have it so easy, man. When I went to school, I had to walk 5 miles barefoot in the snow there and back, and I did it without complaining. Gosh, this new generation, they've gotten so soft. The world, having gone to hell, has existed simultaneously with, and yet we're the greatest ever. How do those two ideas fit together? Those concepts, those constructs of where we are. They do so in tension, certainly, and often unanalyzed or reflected upon. You can find people, most people probably hold both together in their own ideas. But this concept that the good old days were indeed the good old days, the golden age, going back to ancient times, is an idea of a past that was there where everything was wonderful, and we have fallen from it. And so there is a continuous process or progress of actually decline at the same time as we're getting better and better. How do we grapple with that? And as we grapple with that throughout this course, I want you to think of yourself as have things indeed really gotten better? Or is it just different? Now, that is something, for me, in my view, that is based on trying to come up with some meaning in the past and in the present. It is based on the fact that humans and human nature hasn't changed. We still have the same hopes and dreams. We still have the same physical needs as people all along. So when I say, are we happier? Are you happier? Are we happier now than we as human beings were 500 or 1,000 or 5,000 years ago? And I would argue absolutely not. Just because we have more things doesn't mean we are happier. Doesn't mean we are better. Doesn't mean we are more satisfied, fulfilled individuals. History is a process of humans trying to meet their needs, our needs, hopes and desires, dreams. And that has remained the same, even as the context in which those needs, hopes, and dreams and desires are attempted to be met is constantly changing. So, I would argue there's really no such thing as progress. There's no such thing actually as decline or the world going to hell. We could talk about the ecological crisis, global warming, and the feeling that it's all going to come crumbling down. And from a physical basis, with global warming, it actually could. And yet, as historians, we know that humans for a long time have felt an impending doom. Something, some disaster, some huge catastrophe is coming. And it never really has. You say, well, there are catastrophes. The Holocaust certainly was one. And we'll be talking about that when we get there. There have been horrendous events, but the world has continued. Now, whether or not civilization and human culture will continue is another question, because species do go extinct. We can look at the biological life on Earth and say, okay, human beings in their modern form anyway have been around for quite a long time, not nearly as long as some other species. How long do we have left as a species? Are we actually working towards our own demise with what we're doing to the environment? And so. And there could come a time when the greater scheme of the evolutionary development is such that we have evolved beyond ourselves because we have made ourselves extinct by how we've treated our own environment, our own abilities to care for ourselves. Modernity has its costs as well as its benefits. And yet, humans are still here. That too is what we will be looking at in this course. Humans. How have we gone about trying to organize ourselves, govern ourselves? How have we managed the problem between the good of the whole and individual good? If I think something is good for me and I go out and get it, should I be able to do that if that deprives you of getting what you feel is good for you? In some ways, that is what the entire human struggle is about. Balancing and managing the struggle between the individual and the group, or the collective. Okay, I'm talking a lot about this, and we'll be seeing these general themes throughout. So let's go back and look at the very title of this course, History of Western Civilization. And I said we need to problematize it. What is history? What is Western? And what is civilization? So now, moving on then to this, from the second slide to the third, history as a thing of the past. That is so often something you hear. History is a thing of the past. But is it? Let's say, after listening to today's lecture, you think, oh my God, what have I got myself into? And you start drinking heavily, perhaps with friends in your COVID-safe bubble, I hope. And you get so drunk that you fall down and hit your head. Yeah, I'm not advocating that any of you do that, meaning drink heavily or fall down. But if you do, and you wake up after hitting your head, and you're knocked out, let's say you have complete amnesia. Now, I should say, too, I have never had amnesia, so I don't know what I'm talking about. But this is a thought experiment. I want you to kind of run with it with me, if you will. So you wake up with total amnesia, and you wake up, who am I? Why am I here on the floor? How did I get here? What's my name? You can't remember anything. And if someone asks you, who are you? You simply do not know because you cannot remember. But then slowly, little bits start coming back. Oh, yeah. I remember now. My name is Eric Sock. I'm a history professor. Footnote, just in case, in this example, after this lecture, I go out and drink heavily and fall down and hit my head and wake up with amnesia. So I'm putting myself in that category too. Who am I? I know my name now. I remember my name. I have some vague memory that I was talking to a computer. Why was I? Oh, I'm a professor. Oh yeah, where am I, professor? I'm a professor at Harvard. Oops, no, not really. Professor, about cars, races, Indianapolis, University of Indianapolis. No, that's not right either, but it's close. Um, IUPUI. Oh yeah, another piece of the puzzle. Where did I come from? Who are my parents? Where did I grow up? All these things start coming back in bits and pieces. How many of you remember everything you've ever done, thought, felt, or said from the time you were born? I'm assuming none of you are raising your hands. Our memory is selective, whether we have amnesia or not. In some ways, we all have selective amnesia because we cannot remember everything, even if everything we've ever thought, felt, or said is somehow stored somewhere in our brain. We can't access it. I remember some things when I was a child, um, not all that much, but some things here and there. But certainly that person, who I was when I was 4 or 5 or 6, no longer exists except to the extent that I remember. The more I remember, the more of it comes back to me in terms of that. Memory gives us our identity. It tells us who we are. And if we lose our memory, we lose our identity. We lose our sense of who we are in this world. Just as that works for the individual, so it works for a group, a society, something called collective memory. There is a collective memory. Institutional memory, perhaps you've heard about that. Whether it's in business or in government or society, people who maintain the knowledge of what's had been known, what had been discovered, so we know how to do it again. Traditions, that's essentially what that is about. And if those are done away with, it's like we have to go back and start all over again. Whether that is at the university, get a business. If everybody at a business was fired, say the CEO said, "Okay, I'm disgusted with everybody. We're going to fire everybody and get all new people." New people would come in and say, "Okay, what is this business? What is it? What are we doing? How have we done things before?" They would have to learn things all over again or develop things all over again. That's what I mean by collective memory. As a society, who are we as quote unquote Americans, the United States? Oh, we are the bastions of democracy and peace and freedom in the world. Are we? Or have we forgotten some of the horrors that we have inflicted? We don't like to think about the things that are not so nice about ourselves. How many of you, another thought experiment, and you don't have to raise your hand for this, but just think about it. How many of you have ever done something and you remember you're doing it? And you think, God, I wish I hadn't done that. I regret that. That was so bad of me. I'm assuming most of you did. But we don't sit there and parade that around. It's, oh, nice to meet you. Let me tell you about all the horrible things I've done in my life, which I wish I hadn't. I do the same thing. I don't tell you all the horrible things about myself. Well, I'm planning on it anyway. You can probably imagine enough on your own. But anyway, point being, we repress those things that we don't like to think about, that don't fit with how we want to think of ourselves as people. I'm a nice person. I'm a caring person. I'm a thoughtful person. Oh, yeah? What about all the times when I haven't been caring, when I haven't been thoughtful, when I've been really mean, even cruel? Not maybe intentionally, but unintentionally. Well, yeah, I regret some of those things, but that's not really who I am. Societies have the same issue. We don't want to tell ourselves the negatives, so we pretend they didn't happen. The 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, you'll be hearing more about as we get there in this course, one of my favorite philosophers, said, "I have done that," says my memory. "I could not have done that," says my pride, and remains inexorable. Eventually, memory yields. Eventually, memory yields. That's dangerous. Because if we forget or repress or don't want to deal with all the negatives, what are we left with? simply a story about how wonderful we are, which is not based on the historical record. I have on the slide up there the historically affected consciousness. Our consciousness is affected by our past, history, as a society and collectively, whether we're aware of it or not. Why do you believe what you believe? Why do you think what you think? Well, where you come from, the experiences that you have had, your background, all those things affect us. And we can't escape that. There's no neutral point. We can try to be aware of it and aware of the influences we have inherited, the givens, but we can't correct them. We can't make up for them. We can't say, I wish it was something different. But if we can be aware, and the more aware we can be of those forces that have influenced us and are still influencing us, even if we're not aware of them, the more aware we can be of who we are today and who we will be as we go forward. That's what we mean by historically affected consciousness, which comes from another German philosopher, Hans-Georg Gadamer, 19th century, early 20th century. So that we are historical beings, whether we want to be or not. We're not outside of time, independent entities. We are part of history, part of development, part of our society. And we need to see ourselves and our culture, our society, our country, as well as others, in that ongoing context affected by history. And yet, history does not exist. No, I shouldn't say that history does exist. The past does not exist. My 4-year-old self no longer exists. My memory does, but I am in the present now, and I'm ever so much more than 4. Reference to Wendy and Peter Pan. Ever so much more than 20. My 20-year-old self no longer exists. My 30-year self no longer exists. I'm not going to take it much further. Our memory exists in the present. All history exists in the present, based on our memory, our understanding, and the sources that are available to us. Because the sources is what history is about. Historians try to remember, reconstruct what happened in the past based on the evidence available in the present. So much has been lost. We will be getting to World War II, the Nazi period, and all of that. But the Nazi period in Germany has been one of the most sifted through, analyzed, research periods ever, which I think should come as no surprise. And yet, in 1990, I believe it was, if memory serves, I was a member of a group of graduate students, American graduate students, selected for a trip to German archives and libraries run by the German Historical Association. And we were the first group of Westerners to be admitted into the archives in Potsdam. Now, if you don't know already, Potsdam is kind of a suburb of East Berlin, or what used to be East Berlin. And this was right as the wall was coming down, if that means anything to anyone. If it doesn't, we'll get there. Don't worry in this course in terms of the wall, the Eastern, Western European divisions. And the archivist took us into this room. No, not a huge room, but a fairly good-sized room, about the size of a classroom at IUPUI. Any of you have actually been in a classroom at IUPUI. Not one of the big lecture halls, but one of the classrooms. It was filled with documents, say a lot about archives and how documents are stored, but these are boxes on shelves, labeled and filled with documents. And the archivist told us all of these documents in this room are from the Nazi period, and they have never been looked at. And just think about that. Documents from the Nazi period, one of the most researched, combed through periods of history. There's still a room full of documents that no one historian could ever get through in his or her lifetime, that have never been looked at. And most of these are probably very banal and not all that insightful. A receipt for the SS purchasing, 500,000 new pairs of shoestrings or something like that. Those are important administratively. They get recorded, and those receipts get preserved and put in an archive. Those won't tell us that much. But we don't know even what is there until it's looked at. The evidence provides, or the documents provide the evidence for our reconstructing what could have been like, what did happen. On a personal level, my mother used to take photographs of my sister and myself, of our family. And I have several photo albums. If any of you are old enough to remember the photo albums before everything was simply on your phone. And I go back every once in a while and look at those. I haven't recently, but as I look through those pictures and photos, like, oh yeah, I remember that. I completely forgot about that. A couple things here. Those photographs serve as evidence, as a document, documenting something in the past. They exist in the present. I look at them in the present, because I'm sure have been photos that have been lost, to which I have no access. They make me remember. Oh yeah, I remember that. Now, sometimes I think, do I really remember that, or am I reading back into it? And I'm remembering it because I've looked at the photo before. That's something as historians we always have to ask ourselves. We look at documents. The Declaration of Independence is a document. When we read that document today, are we reading back into it what we think it means? Remembering we weren't there, but remembering what we think we know about it? Or are we remembering or looking at or analyzing it? What did it mean in the past? What does that document in the past? We talk about rewriting history. It is realizing that new sources, new documents, new perspectives, new questions are always being asked. So the writing of history is an ongoing process that takes place in the present. Every document that, as a historian, I look at and analyze, I'm doing that in the present of a document that exists in the present. Because once that document, that piece of evidence no longer exists, I have no way of analyzing itself. History is not something that happened that we simply have to go and discover and find. It is an ongoing endeavor, constantly changing, because historians are constantly discovering new documents, looking at new documents, or asking new questions of older documents, having new perspectives. We're trying to understand what this all means in terms of overcoming our collective amnesia of the past, to become more aware of those forces that have affected who we are today. In that sense, history, the continued rewriting of history, the continued pursuit of history, the continued doing of history and teaching of history is not a thing of the past, it's a thing of the present. And the present is constantly new in each and every moment. The reference there to the poet T.S. Eliot. So if history is something we are doing in the present, if it is more problematic than simply, oh, we are just going to go discover what there has happened and it's a closed book and this, that, off we go, it becomes very complex because history, the study of history, is simply the study of humans and how we have gone about trying to fulfill and meet our needs, desires, hopes, dreams, wants, etc., etc. And humans, individually and in groups and societies, are infinitely complex. That's the challenge before us. And it's one that we can't make simple or reduce to something that is even manageable. Now, the history of Western civilization, if we can problematize history, and you may be thinking, okay, I'm not really sure what history is, that's fine, that's good. That's the point of discussing this, is to say, you know what? History is not what we think about. It's not the content of some book. It's not out there that we simply have to find and discover. It's constantly changing and evolving. Our understanding of the past, our memory, we're constantly trying to come to a greater awareness. So that itself is a problem. But so is Western, that term. Here's the third slide, I think it is. No, it's the fourth slide. Fourth slide. What is Western? The Earth is a sphere. Oh, no, surprise, surprise, right? It's not flat. The idea of a flat Earth was a theory that developed in the 19th century. Every educated person, since the Greeks, knew the Earth was round. The Greeks measured its circumference. It was the Ptolemaic universe that put the Earth at the center of the universe in the series of concentric spheres. We all knew it was round. And the myth that Columbus proved that the Earth was not flat is ridiculous. I'm not saying that there weren't people in the ancient times or Middle Ages or the past that thought the Earth was flat, because my gosh, that's what we experience. We don't feel like we're standing on a ball. We feel that we're standing on something flat. But any educated individual knew that it was a sphere. What's the sphere? How do you divide that into east and west? It's a relational concept. It's not based on geography. There's no geographical west. You may be saying, oh, of course there is. The west is Europe and the United States. Oh, yeah? Depending on whom you ask and who is drawing the line and making the distinction between east and west. Here on the fifth slide is a map of the world from 1598, the early part of this course. The so-called New World is there. The New World, obviously, new. How so? New to Europeans who discovered it. It certainly wasn't new to the Native Americans. These were the new invaders coming. We'll be talking more about that too. Europe, if you look at this slide, you'll see, is part of the Eastern Hemisphere. I mean, that's what the top of the map says. It's the depiction. What is it here? Getting it back up. It's the delineation of both hemispheres, the Eastern and the Western hemispheres. The so-called New World is the Western Hemisphere. The Old World is the Eastern Hemisphere. And here, Europe is in the East, just as is Africa and Asia. Because that was known already. That was already known. You can say, yeah, but they just didn't understand geography that well. Maps are not without ideology. You may have seen some maps. If you get a map even today that was made in Europe, they put Europe in the center. American-made maps put America in the center. It all depends on perspective. And those are both geographically correct in terms of longitude and latitude and all those types of things. It's very difficult to get to represent a globe on a flat surface. That's one of the problems. I mean, there are globes that show the world as quote unquote in a representational manner. But once we look at a map, a flat map, how do you translate a globe to a flat surface with a map? That's where the ideology comes in. In another university, University of Tennessee, where I was early on in my career for a couple of years, the chair of the department was a historian of Brazil, and he had a map of the world on his office door. And again, in terms of longitude and latitude and relationships, it was as accurate as any other map. But rather than having the United States or Europe at the center, it had Brazil at the center, and it also had it upside down. You said, wait a minute, upside down. Well, what we are used to. North and south, east and west. There's no such thing. Absolutely. It's all based on relationship. And when you look at that map and you're taking it back because you see, what's that? And you, oh, that's a map. It's just with Brazil in the center. There's an ideology behind map making. There's an interpretation involved. If you start heading east, if you go far enough, you end up in the west. So what constitutes the west? It's a problem. And any delineation, whether it's from 1598 or in 2021, is based on ideology, on concepts and perspectives and where you are and how you construct the world and put it all together. That is what we need to look at too and realize that this course, history is problematic. Western is now very problematic. How is that delineated and defined? But so then is civilization. Now, if you've had 113, first part of this course, you've gone over the rise of civilization and all that. Civilization is not the same as culture. There's been human culture for ages before there was human civilization. Civilization, the word comes from the Latin civis or civilis, which in Latin means city or citizen or civil. Civilization is life in cities. And cities didn't arise until, well, it's debatable, but approximately 4000 BCE, so approximately 6,000 years ago or so, we find the emergence of cities. How are cities defined? That's also a debated question. Often one accepted general definition is a settlement of human culture, a densely populated area, which does not mean like density in our terms, but 200, 300, 400 people or more, with a wall and one monumental structure. A wall. Why build a wall? Or to keep people out, or to keep people in. As human culture and humans develop from nomadic hunters and gatherers to being settled in cities based on the domestication of plants and animals, agriculture, all those things that happened approximately 10,000 BCE. It took a long time. And with the beginning of civilization, life in cities, all of a sudden it's a concentration of resources, of wealth. And there's still other groups of human beings who might want some of that wealth. So if you build a wall, that helps protect from people coming in and taking what you have. It means there is the potential for violence and conflict. There's no potential for conflict, you don't need a wall. In other words, the very beginnings of civilization, we find violence as part of what civilization was. Conflict, human conflict. We think of civilization as a good thing, a wonderful development. What was it and why? Another way of looking at civilization is realizing that civilization is distinct from culture. And with culture, we use that word in many ways. We talk about, a culture in a petri dish in terms of biology, chemistry, or science. It's a culture of something. We talk about human culture. We talk about high culture. We talk about low culture. We talk about being civilized or uncivilized, being cultured or uncultured. Oh, I am so civilized. I go to the opera. I only drink tea, holding out my pinky. I do not swear. I do not, wipe my nose in public. I do. I use a handkerchief. I don't just wipe it on my sleeve. How disgusting, vile. Why do we have those ideas? Why do we have the ideas that we have to act in a certain way? Manners. And how do manners change and customs change over time? Because we use such things to demarcate ourselves from the other, almost another form of wall. Civilized people don't do that. We are in cities, we're civilized, as opposed to all of those country bumpkins. And that is still with us. This divide between urban and rural, between people living in cities and people living in the country. Major issue for us still today, and always has since the origins of civilization. I grew up on a farm, and I experienced it very well. People in cities think people in the country and farms are backward and stupid and slow. They don't really any longer consider us to be barbarian. It's not politically correct. There's still this concept that somehow there's a huge difference between country folk and people who are sophisticated living in cities. And if you've grown up, you know that. There's a long background to that development. Concept of culture as opposed to civilization. Culture comes from cultura, which means to weave, to bring together, to cultivate. It's the basis of agricultura, agriculture, the cultivation of the fields, the weaving together of the fields. The text also is a weave. What a text is, but that's another issue as well. And this distinction between agriculture and city life, because people in the city don't need to live on the farm. They bring people in from the farm and those types of things, is still there. There's a bias within the cities against farmers in the country. At least that's what I experienced. And if any of you have grown up in a rural setting, I think I'd be willing to bet you understand that as well. And there's some level of reality to it. Remember, this is back in the 70s. There was issues political for farmers in California, where I grew up in Central California, which is very Midwestern. And my father was really disgusted because he was president of the county farm bureau and things like that, and wanted to go through the normal political channels to get things done to represent the interests and needs of farmers. But there were a bunch of farmers who said, we're going to march on Washington. We're going to drive our tractors to Washington. And they did. And my dad was like, oh my God. Because think about it. People driving tractors to Washington to protest. What a bunch of hicks. It almost gives evidence of that bias that is there. A footnote, bias. We all like to think, I'm not biased. We are all biased. Bias just means perspective, from a particular perspective. There's no such thing as being absolutely neutral. There's no neutral point of observation, but that's something perhaps I'll come back to. But this bias on the part of the urban folk, be urbane, be civilized, over against the country folk. It's simply a continuation of the original distinction between the civilized and the barbarians, which goes back to the Greeks. Barbarians. How many of you would say, I'm a barbarian? No, we don't want to be barbarians. We're civilized. The Greeks felt themselves superior. They felt themselves civilized. And they spoke Greek. And if you didn't speak Greek, you weren't really with it. And you sounded funny. We couldn't understand you. You sounded like you were just saying bar, 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 bar. All those people who were not Greek were then the barbarians, those who said bar, 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 bar. How many of you speak Greek? I don't. I know the Greek alphabet. I can pick out words. I can put out phrases. I can use Greek a little bit. I don't speak Greek. I'm a barbarian. But then it became expanded. So the civilized then were not just Greeks, but then Latins, Romans. So if you didn't speak Latin or Greek, then you were the barbarians. You know, whole development in H114. We also teach a 300 level course, the early Middle Ages, which had been called barbarian Europe. We talk a lot about the barbarians and who they were and what that meant, how the word was termed. But that division between the civilized and the barbarians is still with us in terms of the country and urban dichotomy. Us and them. That's what it's all about. Us and them. That's been with humans, cultures, civilizations, whatever you want to call it, from the very beginning of human society. We are good, they are bad. We are civilized, they are not. They're barbarians and uncultured. How do we work together? Well, they need to become like us, and maybe we can, but if we don't, or we don't want to become uncivilized, it's a real problem. And it's not one that is overcomable, at least based on any experience that we've had before as human beings. It's still here. Us and them, a dichotomy. Think of the divisions in our society today. Why is there such animosity and tensions? There's all kinds of reasons. But doesn't it all come back to, in many ways, this basic dichotomy between us and them? We want what we want. And as long as we get what we want, we can tolerate them unless they want what we want. There's not enough for everybody to have what they want. So we don't want them to get what we have. That's the conflict, whether it is an issue based on race, gender, um, other identities, language, is still a fundamental aspect of societal divisions within our society. How do we deal with it? What are countries anyway, except us and them? This is how we define ourselves. This is who we are. And we will defend it militarily with our borders and boundaries, keeping out the other whom we don't want. The concept of civilization needs to be problematized, and the concept of Western civilization needs to be problematized, as does the concept of history itself. And that is what I want to look at in this course. Because these concepts and this dichotomy between us and them is based on identity and who we are. And who we are is based on our memory, which is selective. And if we have to be forced to realize that we're not what we think we are, we're not necessarily what we want to be or think that we should be or could be, we have to come to terms with all aspects, with all evidence that indicate to us, you know what? The basis for you drawing this distinction between us and them, between you and me, is based on something that is faulty, is based on a construct, because you're not aware of what you've done. Yeah. In this context, and I'm trying to get back to my PowerPoint slides here. I keep messing up a little bit. We move to then slide 7, I believe it is. We're getting there. I'm sorry here. My apologies. There. No, that's not it. Where are we? Here we go. Boop. This is, I thought I had some breaking boundaries and borders, slide 7. Yes. What this, still about what this course is about and what we're doing here. Breaking boundaries and borders, those boundaries that we draw for ourselves. We can never get away from them. We can never get away from this you, me dichotomy, because I am not you. You are not me. The question is, what do we do about that and how do we manage that? The awareness of the problems and the issues, though, is the beginning point. Recognizing ideological boundaries. Yeah, that's right. Will the West always be in conflict with the East? Well, it probably will, unless we can start to realize that these are artificial, ideologically constructed boundaries and divisions. We have to realize what are the forces that we have inherited that have made us think what we think, that have made us believe what we believe. Which is not to say that we then come to a point where we just, oh my gosh, look at that and let's get rid of it. No, it's just to be aware of how our consciousness has been formed, our understanding has been formed, our beliefs, our hopes and dreams have been formed. And the influences on them, whether we're aware of them or not. It's only at that point that we can then not overcome this dichotomy of you and me, us and them, but begin to say, how can we manage this in a better way for all of us? It is having to realize that we're not who we think we are. That's the shock of history. And once we can be shocked, as again the poet T.S. Eliot said, each and every moment is a shocking evaluation of all we have been. Once we can allow ourselves to be shocked and to deal with that, deal with that knowledge, that recognition, we can come to a new awareness. And that new awareness, based on the shock of history, going beyond these boundaries that we have constructed and that have been constructed for us, allows for us to change, to develop, to grow, to become something we are not now. That's the importance of history. That's the importance of this course, to bring us to a higher level of awareness, a higher degree of self-knowledge of who we are and how we have come to be and how we want to go on from here. Now, we can then move on to some of the more practical aspects of this course. This is then slide 8. What is this course? Which is we've been talking about all the way up to this point. And the first point there I have is the myth of the West. Yes, all I've been talking about, this ideological construct. Is myth. A myth is simply a story we tell ourselves about a truth. So often, myth is contrasted with true. That's not true, that's a myth. There's a degree to which that is true, accurate, but I am using myth in a more specific sense here. There are different levels of truth. There's quote unquote objective truth. I don't really think there is, but there's scientific truth. It's true that the molecule of water is H2O. We can prove that. We can repeat that experiment and show that. But what about even scientifically, if we go beyond the atoms that make up the molecule, we get into the subatomic particles. We talk about quarks with flavors and spins. How many of you have seen a quark? How many of you have tasted a quark? How we know what the flavor is? Those are ways of describing what we observe. Same thing with black holes. There's no such thing as a black hole. Black hole is a term we use to describe what we have observed. You could call it something else if you wanted. You could call it the giant light-eating monster. The evidence would be the same. Okay, what we observe, what we measure, would be exactly the same, but we call it something different. It's still descriptive. A giant light-eating monster is as descriptive as a black hole. But how we label what we observe is very revealing of our ideology, our construct, how we put everything together. And those constructs express something that cannot be expressed in any other way. Those constructs are what I refer to as myth. And in a technical sense, there's a whole study of mythology. Myth expresses a truth, but a truth that is on a poetic level. Is there truth in poetry? Is there truth in metaphor? I would say absolutely. It's not natural scientific truth. It's not mathematical truth. It may not even be logical truth. But there is a truth expressed. Love. Love cannot be quantified. But is it true? Think about the impact of love on civilization. Think about the impact of hate on civilization. And what do we love? And what do we hate and why? Those are myths that we tell ourselves because we want to feel that we have reasons for loving what we love and hating what we hate. But those myths are what we need to analyze, not dismiss, because we can't dismiss them because we just will replace that with another myth. So in general, this course is about the myth of the West, chronologically, approximately from 1500 to approximately 2020, even though we'll start a little bit earlier, and how that story of people in the West started referring to themselves as Western over again. The East, the barbarians, and how that interaction all worked and developed over time. That's what we're getting at, the myth of the West, the myth of Western civilization. Looking at both the positive developments as well as the negatives, the horrors, what we have done, those things we wish we hadn't. Because only when we can take both together can we come to a greater sense of who we are and where we're going. So that is, in a nutshell, everything I've said to this point, summarized in terms of this course is about the myth of the West in the chronological period, approximately 1500 to approximately 2020. That's what this course is about, civilization, which is a myth as well. But on the practical level, we have then the structures of this course. I've already mentioned this 100% online course. And we'll get through it one way or the other. The lectures will be posted, both the videos and the PowerPoints. Your assignments have been posted. The syllabus has been posted, and I hope you will read through the syllabus, read through the assignments. 3 basic components, the textbook, the sources, and the lectures. Those are all part of what your grade will be based on. And you need to take into account when you write your midterm and your final. You have to show that you have at least grasped or understood or taken into account the readings assigned in the textbook, the lectures, and the sources. The sources are so important. Are all there on Canvas. Um, they're all posted online. You can read those sources per week. Those are like the pictures in the photograph album going back. Oh yeah, that's that. Those are like the documents that tell us, um, that signify somehow in the present what had happened. How do we use those? What do we make of those? But it's what the sources is what history is based on. Because otherwise, it's just fiction. It's just storytelling and made up fantasy. I can make up all kinds of things about myself, but if I can't document it and provide evidence for it, someone can say, "Yeah, but why do you say that?" There's no evidence of it. That is a problem that we face today in our country very well indeed. People who say things and have said things, who believe things for which there is no evidence. As historians, we have to stand against that. That would bring us into a whole longer development in terms of the difference between knowledge and belief. I'm not against belief in any way, shape, or form. Everyone is entitled to their own beliefs, their own opinions. But in the realm of history, those beliefs and opinions themselves are historical evidence because we know people believed X, Y, and Z. As historians will in the future write about the history of 2020, QAnon will be a major part of the political history of the United States in 2020. What's the evidence for it? If we were just to say, the government, whatever we might think about it, is not simply a bunch of satanic pedophiles. Simply not. So we just dismiss it as, that's crazy. Okay, but look at the impact that that belief has had. What's the evidence? Historians need evidence, as do politicians if they're going to get away with things, but they've gotten away with a lot of things without any evidence whatsoever. Oh, yes, the election was a fraud, stolen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All those things we hear about, I'm bombarded with on a daily basis for the last 5 years. What's the evidence? History is evidence-based. So the sources are important because if you're answering a question on your midterm or your final, it's not just what you think, what you make up. You have to defend your position with evidence. If you are a lawyer in court and you're trying to defend your client and you don't have any evidence, no one's going to believe what you say. Your Honor, my client is an outstanding young man. He would never have done what he's accused of doing. He never would have used a gun to rob a store. We know that. I know that. I can vouch for him. And we have other people who will say, oh, I know him and he was just great. He would never do something like that. Well, the prosecutor would say, yeah, but you know what? This is a gun that was registered to him, has his fingerprints on it, was found at the scene. What do you say to that? Oh, I don't know, but it's not, it's not his. Evidence has to be based. There's the basis for analysis, for historical statements, and therefore also for your exams, bringing in information from the lectures, from the textbook, and we'll talk more about that as we go. And they're there for you to read. The textbook you need to purchase or rent or borrow, one way or the other, and show that you've grasped that material too. And your grade for your midterm and final will be based on how well you put together the lectures, the textbook, and the sources. How does that all work? I'll say more about the midterms and final when we get further along. I have posted guides to writing the midterm and final, so read through those guides. And with the lectures, even though this is not in class, even though you can go back and listen to it again and again, I still would very much strongly encourage that you take notes. This is part of the course material. which will be the basis for the evaluation of your midterms and midterm and final for your final grade. So, again, that's one of the values or the positives, upsides of video lecture. You can stop it at any time, go back, take notes. Say, okay, I missed that. Whereas in a lecture in a class, um, if you miss something because you're taking notes, oh, what was that he just said? It's gone. But here you can stop and go. So please, um, it would be in your best interest in terms of your grade to show that you can grasp the lectures. Not say you have to agree with me. Definitely, you don't have to agree with me. That's not the point. But the point is that you at least understand what I have said and what it's based on and why I've said it. Interpretation is not the same as opinion. We can disagree on interpretation of something. But if you can defend it based on the evidence, it's valid. For the midterm and the final, there are no right or wrong answers. This is not about saying, oh, no, you missed that because, 2 and 2 does not equal 5, it equals 4. That's not how history is done. There are good answers and bad answers. For a good answer, you need to incorporate the course material, the lectures, the textbook. Again, we can disagree. But if we disagree, it's not going to be because you have a different opinion from mine. It's going to be because you have a different interpretation of the sources and you can defend your position. That's the basis for it. Democrats and Republicans disagree in terms of interpretation, but if they can't agree on what the evidence is, then it's a real problem. That's the situation we face today. Should we raise taxes? That's a matter for debate. Is there a problem with the deficit? Absolutely. What do we do about it? Well, depending on your interpretation, you might have one view, Republican view in general. Oh, we don't want to raise taxes. Democratic view, yeah, we really need to. But the problem is, if we don't agree on what it is we're arguing about, it's simply opinions, and we go nowhere. Arguing is not saying, well, I'm right. You say, no, I'm right. No, you're not. I'm right. That gets us nowhere. It has to be based on the evidence. Okay? So, again, you're welcome to disagree with me. You just have to defend your position and give evidence for it. So, those are the components of the course. Practicalities, requirements. I've already referenced the midterm and the final. So they're posted. And in addition to the midterm and the final, there's also a semester project or a term paper. It's posted as the Human Rights Project. You have 5 texts you're supposed to read, analyze, and evaluate in terms of human rights, their origins, their developments, and what it means for us today. And we'll be talking more about that as we go along. But it is to get us to think about, where do human rights come from? What do we do about them? How do we manage these rights we claim to have? And what difference does that make? The appeal to human rights can be revolutionary, as it was in the American Revolution, as it was in the French Revolution. But rights for whom? And what to do about it? Where do they come from? And what does that mean for us today? In many ways, we'll see as we go along. That I think is a very fundamental aspect of the development of the Western tradition in this period, that we need to grapple with, because appeals to human rights have been revolutionary, are revolutionary, and still can be. Which is either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your perspective. But what do we mean when we appeal to them? Inalienable human rights, just because I'm human. And if I'm human with these rights, you, me, you, us, them, if they're also human, don't they have the same rights as I do? I said earlier, we can never get beyond this binary opposition between us and them, between you and me. And we can't, and yet, if we recognize the similarities, human beings, that all have rights, then what do we do about that? It's funny, I'll be saying this, I may mention this in a next lecture, future lecture. The Dutch, in the 17th century, the East India Company for spice trade, and the West India Company was very much involved in the slave trade. And we had these good Dutch Calvinist Protestant slave traders. And one of them wrote a letter to his superior saying that we really have a problem here. These Africans, if they are human, fully human, as are we, then how can we justify doing what we're doing? Because they're God's creatures too, in the image of God. Now, if they're not, okay, that's a different thing. But if they are, there's a real problem here. If our opponents are humans, do they not merit, deserve the same rights and privileges that we have? If our rights are based on our being human rather than being wealthy, don't the poor, whatever ethnic background, whatever color of their skin, have the same human rights as the wealthy? How do we manage those things? That's what I want you to think about in terms of the Human Rights Project, and the whole concept of human rights is very much an early modern and modern idea. So it's very fitting that this is in my view, that this is the focus for your term paper as it goes throughout the course all the way until the present, because we're still talking about human rights, and rightly so. Now, I'll be saying more about those things as we get closer up to their due date and present them in lectures, at least to begin with, as we're getting closer to having to start working on them and writing about them. But I just want to make sure that you're aware that's a major aspect of your final grade. It's 40% of your grade. If you look at the syllabus, the term paper is 40% of the grade. The final and midterms are each worth 30%. Now, keys to success in all of this. Keep up with the reading. Okay. 100% online course, as I said already, supposedly structurally dictated to be squeezed into 13 weeks, but you can do it at your own pace, aside from the final due date and getting things in on time. You need to get the midterm in on time. You need to get your final your term paper, your human rights project in on time, and the final exam in on time. But otherwise, as far as I'm concerned, this is pretty open. But if you keep up with the reading, in terms of the week by week schedule, that will help. You do not want to, I promise you, you do not want to put everything off and say, okay, I can do it whenever, so I'll wait until, April 15th. Once I get my taxes in, then I'll start, okay, now I'll just bang out these 3 assignments and get them done. That will not be in your best interest, I promise you. So try to keep up with the lectures. Listen, take good notes. Try to say, okay, how does what I hear in the lectures fit with what I'm reading in the textbook and what I'm reading in the sources? How do you put those all together? Because those are 3 separate components. My point in my lectures is not to give you information. It is, even though I will be giving you information from time to time anyway, it's to offer you perspective and how you put things together that you need to try to grasp. Another aspect, because there is a lot of work in this course, how do you get through it? Find something that you're interested in. Look for it. If you can find your special interest or something that is especially interesting to you and focus on that, that will help get you through the drudgery of all the work And it is drudgery. You just got to learn how to do it and get through it. That's the case in anything you do, in any job you do. You can say, well, I'm being so naive here or whatever, but going back to Mary Poppins, in every job that must be done, there's an element of fun. You find the fun and snap, the job's a game. Same thing with a history course or any other course. If you can find something that you can hook into, that you can relate to, or find especially intriguing or fascinating, you can use that to get through and get the job done. That's what it is. And finally, dare to challenge yourself. Challenge yourself to open up to question. Who am I, indeed? Well, it's thought I've known, but maybe I don't. Why do I believe what I believe? On what basis do I believe it? On what basis do I think what I think? How do I know what I know? Who am I after all? And can I come to a higher understanding, not even necessarily higher, but a broader awareness of who I am as I'm growing, becoming something I'm not? It's another reference to T.S. Eliot. And I'll probably come back to again and again because he's one of my favorite poets. But also I think very insightful. In my end is my beginning. That's what this course is about, making new beginnings by increasing and expanding our awareness of who we are as individuals, as society, as a civilization, and how we've gotten to this point, and where do we go from here as we continue to grow into the future. That's what this course is about. Welcome again, and I hope you'll make the most of it. Thank you very much.